Welcome everyone to track 4. Thanks for venturing across the hall down here to the other side of the hotel. For the West Coast LCFS policy update panel. I guess before beginning, I'll just get a chance to introduce myself. My name is Matt Lithgow. I'm a correspondent with Carbon Pulse, covering carbon markets and climate policy developments in North America. And that also includes LCFS. And so the speakers today are going to go over some of the projected updates to the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, to Oregon's Clean Fuels Program, and then we're also going to discuss a new pathway for incorporating LCFS credits from methane reduction projects as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panel that we have here. So from CARB, we have Sam Wade. From Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, we have Cory-Ann Wind. And from the Climate Trust, we have Peter Weisberg. So thanks everyone for coming out. And yeah, I guess we'll get started here with Sam Wade from CARB.
All right, thanks very much, Matt. Can everyone hear me okay? So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sam Wade. I work at the Air Resources Board, and I oversee the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. The Low Carbon Fuel Standard is one of the key pieces of the broad AB 32 portfolio of climate policies that we have in California. It targets the promotion of alternative fuels, and I'll get into some examples of specifically what I'm talking about. But I know this conference historically has been more focused on the cap and trade system. There is a lot of overlap between these two markets at this point. And certainly the LCFS and the cap and trade program aren't the only emission credits that we have in the broad portfolio of greenhouse gas policies. We also have our zero emission vehicle credits and our renewable portfolio standard. So together, those large programs help promote the long run reductions in greenhouse gases that we're looking for. But the LCFS really is a key portion of that portfolio that hasn't always received as much attention from the carbon market community. So I'm pleased to be here today. Thanks to CAR for the opportunity. I really want to be sure to convey to everybody how much we do feel that it's important to get areas, especially dairy projects, those types of things that have historically been thought of more in the cap and trade space, engaged and as a key part of the low carbon fuel standard. So let me just start with a little bit of background on what we've accomplished so far. Not sure the clicker's working here. There we go. So this chart shows the volumes of alternative fuels on this side that we've seen over time. And this side shows the amount of credits that have been generated, in terms of tons. So basically 1 million metric tons for each of these fuels. So you can see that in the start of the program in 2011, the only real fuels we had in state was ethanol and renewable or fossil natural gas. And you've seen that that's remained relatively constant in terms of volume, because we've been at an E10 blend and our total demand for gasoline hasn't changed a whole lot in that time period. Where we've seen the growth in volume has been in the liquid diesel substitutes, both biodiesel shown in blue and renewable diesel shown in orange. And we've seen a transition from fossil natural gas to renewable natural gas. So that's the green getting smaller and the red getting bigger. And electricity in purple just beginning to emerge on sort of the volume or energy units over here. On the credit side, you see a little bit of a different trend with electricity playing a bigger role, because an EV can go much further on the same unit of energy than a conventional vehicle can. But you see a nice balanced portfolio of all these low carbon fuels contributing to the program right now. A few stats, we've gotten roughly a 14% renewable content blend in the diesel pool. So on average across the whole state, every gallon of diesel fuel you buy has 14% bio-based content, either renewable diesel or biodiesel. And the ethanol that we use has gotten cleaner over time. That's why the ethanol credits has gone up, even though the volume has stayed the same. And on the renewable natural gas side of things, we're up at about 68% renewable natural gas in every CNG vehicle out there in the state. So the LCFS has definitely helped drive this transition. Other policies like the federal RFS have contributed. But we really think this is a good model for promoting the adoption of low carbon fuels, and we encourage other jurisdictions to move forward with a similar policy. This chart shows the credit price over time in the little dashes, and then the volumes of credits traded in the blue bars. So the reason usually I put this up here is just to show that we've had some volatility in the credit price, primarily associated with lawsuits in the early days of the program. That's why you saw a very long period where we were in the 20s. But recently, we've gotten to very robust credit prices. We're up at about 145 or so today, and that isn't a dollar per metric ton basis. So you can compare that to cap and trade prices, pretty much apples to apples, although we do take a life cycle approach to our greenhouse gas scoring in the LCFS. But significant volume traded, a high value market overall that is available to low carbon fuel project developers and proponents. This chart shows the credit bank over time and how credits and deficits have been generated quarterly. We've built up a bank of credits, which will be important for hitting our sort of long run goals. And then the bank has begun to flatten out a little bit here. So I think that shows the program is biting a little bit more. And the balance between credits and deficits are roughly equal in the most recent data that we have available. So we are proposing some new amendments to the program, and the goal of those new amendments is primarily to extend the program with additional stringency through 2030. There are other major policy changes we're also incorporating as we go about adding that 2030 goal to align with our SB 32 targets. The biggest change is probably that we're incorporating alternative jet fuel, and that's a major scope change, and I'll have a slide on that coming up. We're adding carbon capture and sequestration, making that feasible to do in the system, enhancing some of the refinery credits we have, and add third-party verification, and focusing a little bit more on the connection between this program and zero-emission vehicle infrastructure. So now I'll go through each of those topics with a little bit more detail. So starting with the target setting we're trying to do out through 2030. For a long time, we've talked about the goal of the program to be achieving a 10% reduction in carbon intensity by 2020 relative to a 2010 base year. We're now extending that and talking about 2030 as the milestone year and saying we want a 20% reduction in carbon intensity by that year. As we've done that, we've sort of smoothed the rate of decline toward the 2030 milestone because we're well on track to hit our 2020 AB 32 goals economy-wide. So you can see, as a point of comparison, what a 20% reduction sort of means. All of these major alternative fuels that I talked about in the earlier slide, biodiesel, renewable diesel, biomethane, ethanol, electricity, hydrogen, all of them have a weighted average carbon intensity well below that 20% target. And so what we really need is more of all of those fuels in the out years. Yeah, question? No, that's right. So the way this works is, AB 32 was passed originally, and it included the requirement to do a scoping plan on an ongoing basis. And the scoping plan is the document where we balance various policies, right? And we say we should do a little bit more of LCFS and maybe a little bit less of something else, right? And so we went through that exercise after SB 32 was passed and after the milestones was sort of shifted forward in time to have 2030 be the primary year that we're focused on. And as we did that, we talked about an LCFS at roughly an 18% stringency. We then made some adjustments to the out years to ask for a 20% in our staff proposal that's out there on the street today. But we made the near-term years a little less stringent so that the cumulative stringency was still the same, and therefore the overall amount of greenhouse gas reductions we achieve in the total time period were still in line with what we said in the scoping plan. So, basically, all these alt fuels are going to help a lot in reaching these long-run goals. The little range here is the range in carbon intensity you see for each of those fuels. So we want to push everything down toward the lower end of those range and ideally expand it even more toward the lower side of things. But all those fuels are significant, and they're all commercially available today. And I'll get into some scenarios about what that means. So as part of our rulemaking, we have to do scenario analysis to show what types of low-carbon fuels we expect to occur to make hitting our targets feasible. We did a wide variety of scenarios. I'm just showing you sort of our middle-of-the-road case or best guess case. And what you see in that scenario is we expect continued contribution from just about everything. So again, it's the same sort of chart as I showed you earlier, volumes on one side, credits on this side. You see the liquid diesel substitutes carrying a lot of the volumetric growth, especially in renewable diesel in the light green. But on the credit generating side, you see electricity and other things playing a much bigger role moving forward. We also have projects right here, petroleum projects, so that's reductions in the petroleum supply chain, which have not been a huge part of the program to date, but we do expect additional contributions from in the 2030 timeframe. And then, of course, we show the addition of alt jet fuel here as well, and that contributing something in that time frame as well. So let me talk about that a little bit. The greenhouse gases from jet travel are increasing significantly relative to other sectors, and California does not have any programs to deal with that sector at this point in time. And so we believe that the LCFS is an appropriate place to start to try and lead in that area. Basically, the proposed amendments would allow credits to be generated for the use of alternative jet fuels, but would not create deficits for the use of fossil fuels. And that's with sort of respect to the international borders of aviation travel and all the efforts that have been made at the international level to begin to address those emissions. So that's how we envision it working, is that we will provide a credit for the use of alt fuels, and those credits can be sold to those that sell high carbon fuels like conventional gasoline and diesel in California. So the next area I'd like to talk about is, sorry, question?
Yeah, hey Sam, so on the aviation fuels, I'm curious, has ARB thought about or looked at any other sectors as potentially unregulated
Right.
sectors for potential opt-in similar to what you're doing in aviation?
So we do have a couple other changes. We are proposing that propane be covered for the first time, and we're kind of mandating that hydrogen participate, given the SB 1505 requirements that ARB is supposed to be enforcing there. But we have not looked at using this policy in, say, like the industrial sector or the maritime. We have not yet looked at maritime fuels as seriously as we have jet fuels, although there are, of course, biofuel opportunities there. We just have not gone down that road yet. I do think in the future we could consider that. And I think in discussions of these types of policies outside of California, for example, Canada, their clean fuels system is clearly being talked about as covering more sectors than just transport. So these types of policies can certainly be applied in other sectors. But in California so far, we've kept this pretty focused on transport. And when I say that, I mean the on-road transportation and now aviation. So let me talk a little bit about the petroleum opportunities, or the conventional fuel supply chain opportunities, if you will. As I said, those haven't been a huge source of credits so far in the system, but it is something where we believe there's potential. There was a recent announcement from ERA and GlassPoint about a very large sort of concentrating solar project that they're planning to do that would generate steam for enhanced oil recovery. And that would be almost 400,000 metric tons of CO2 per year if that project goes forward, and that's significant in the scale of credits that we're looking for in the out years. So we hope to see more of those types of actions. We also hope that we can create incentives for actions at the conventional petroleum refineries that serve California. We're focused on innovative actions there. I guess the clearest example of an innovative action would be carbon capture and sequestration. Previously that hasn't been something that was really permissible in the system, but we've now adopted, or we hope to adopt a protocol about that technology and allowing those projects to move forward. We're also removing some of the other restrictions we had on these refinery projects that previously maybe prevented them from being used fully. We're adding third-party verification to the LCFS in this rulemaking. Those of you who participate in cap and trade in the offset world understand this concept very well, I think. It's certainly something that we now believe is just best practice for these types of systems, given all the attention we've paid to it on the MRR and the cap and trade offset side of things. So we're setting up a very similar program for the LCFS data. And it'll still involve CARB being the accreditation body and overseeing the training of verifiers and accrediting the verifiers. and annual site visits for most of the facilities that are involved in the system. And really evaluation both of the carbon intensity of each of the fuels that people claim credits based on, and of the fuel volumes that are reported over time. Let me talk a little bit about our focus on zero emission vehicle fuels. So this would be primarily electricity and hydrogen. The governor had a recent executive order calling for 5 million ZEVs in California by 2030. And in that executive order, it calls out the low carbon fuel standard as a primary tool to help promote ZEV infrastructure adoption. We believe that the program can help with that transition, but we certainly need additional input on how to maximize the ability of the LCFS to help drive infrastructure. The current proposal that we're looking to try and do in this regulation is probably just an incremental step toward that, but we're going to start by trying to better reward the optimization or matching of renewable power with zero emission vehicles. And so we have some new crediting terms that allow for that to be better rewarded. And sort of the existing framework for credits to electricity for using grid power, if you will, remains unchanged. So just a brief mention of a lawsuit for those of you who are actually participants in this market already. We've had an ongoing series of lawsuits which, as I showed in the price figures, sort of diminished the enthusiasm for the program in the initial years, but we're getting closer and closer, we believe, to resolving all those challenges. And so one that still remains is a process-based lawsuit focused on the California Environmental Quality Act and how we approached our analyses for that in earlier rulemaking. As part of this rulemaking, we're releasing additional material to try and address that claim. But what it sort of means for those of you who are actually participating is that the diesel standard in the system will sort of stay fixed at a 2017 level until the court says we've done everything that we're supposed to have done. And that we have a guidance on that issue if anyone wants more details. So here's where we are with the rulemaking. We're roughly here in the Q2, beginning of Q2, and we've released our formal package, and we're accepting formal written stakeholder comments. We'll have a board hearing at the end of the month here, where the board will hear the item and try and understand these proposed changes, and then give us additional direction, if necessary, about what they would like to see us adjust. We'll do that with a workshop in May, and then some formal regulatory text in Q3. And then a second board hearing probably toward the end of Q3 where the board will be asked to vote on the amendments. So that's sort of the proposed timing. And then the rule will be in effect on January 1, 2019, assuming all goes according to what our plan is. I just wanted to close with a re-emphasis on the dairy portion of things because I know there are dairy project developers who attend this event. And we, as part of our broad focus on short-lived climate pollutants and the reduction of methane being so critical, we've had lots of legislation. The board's thought a lot about how to address that. We brought in additional benefits to dairy projects that turn their dairy methane into RNG for use in a vehicle fuel. That's already pretty well rewarded because those types of projects receive the cellulosic RIN in the federal RFS. But we've also now offered significant value in the LCFS for those types of projects. And so this chart over here sort of shows the range of value at various LCFS credit prices. So when prices are around 120, that's $43 per MMBTU, which is obviously a lot more than the energy value of that gas. So we're continuing to do work with stakeholders about how to promote as many of these dairy projects as possible in state to eliminate the methane issues that we have in the valley from dairies. And it's a very high priority for the board, and the LCFS is a key tool to help accomplish that transition. So that's all I have. I'd be happy to take questions. Okay.
I think we have one right here.
Sorry, yeah.
Just on the refinery, you mentioned that you're going to be doing some things to enable some investments to proceed in the refinery. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, sure. So the current rule has refinery investment credit provisions in it, but they haven't been used yet. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First, the eligibility thresholds are relatively high. And so you have not seen refiners be able to bring forward projects that meet all of those thresholds. And second, I think it was just the refineries had not engaged very much on the issue earlier and did not sort of flesh out the rule to make it match what they thought was an appropriate way to design a program like this. We've been working with everybody more on this this time around, and we're trying to make that a little bit more significant part of this program. Partially because we believe there are real reductions that can occur in our conventional fuel supply chain, and partially because of the need to achieve criteria pollutant reductions at these facilities. And so a lot of these projects would also achieve benefits that are called for sort of under AB 617 and other community level reduction programs. So that we think there's some synergies here. We think that the LCFS value can sort of go to reward some of those projects that are win-win from both a greenhouse gas and criteria pollutant perspective. And so we're emphasizing that this time around. Yeah, Robert.
Tim, having thought about you mentioned the money going towards EV, and I thought I heard it sounded like it would be going to EV infrastructure, so charging stations. Is that
Yeah.
the direction versus
Sure.
rebate for vehicles versus, because a lot of those rebates for vehicles are on the verge of phasing out.
Sure. So let me speak a little bit about how the program works today. We have the utilities receiving the credits for residential charging, and they take those credits, they sell them to oil companies. They take the money and they offer rebates. So if you're in, I guess, PG&E's service territory, since we're here, you can get a $500 rebate from PG&E that's funded by LCFS credit revenue. So that is already in place. And then simultaneously for public charging, companies like ChargePoint get LCFS credits for the electricity they dispense through those public charging stations. And the way those credits are calculated today is all at using sort of a California grid average carbon intensity, obviously, which is not fully renewable. So the new amendments sort of add additional support for those that come forward with fully renewable pathways, and it rewards that change in carbon intensity from the grid average to the renewable CI, which is basically zero. We don't want to disrupt those existing utility programs, so it's not that we're saying you can't, the utility programs will change. We think they're helpful. But instead, we want to, provide value to those that are doing EV infrastructure in line with the governor's direction. Yeah.
Sam, how would you describe, you mentioned there's new crediting terms for ZEBs.
Mm-hmm.
You touched upon that. Can you flesh out a little bit more?
Sure. So I was trying to just sort of address that in Robert's question. So as I was saying, there's a difference between the existing framework, which is all based on sort of a grid average carbon intensity, and the framework that we're trying to achieve now, which would offer even greater reward for sort of lower carbon supply of electricity. And we believe that would primarily be taken advantage of by infrastructure providers like ChargePoint and others. They've had a lot of talk with us about, hey, we have a portfolio of renewables that we could use to serve our charging stations, and we'd like a reward for that. Some of the other folks who are interested in that are the vehicle manufacturers like Tesla, and also some of the community choice aggregators who have renewable products that they offer to retail customers that are above and beyond the RPS, the renewable portfolio standard.
What about the hydrogen side?
Yeah, so on the hydrogen side, if you use a renewable source of power to generate hydrogen, you will be fully rewarded. In the past, it was just more challenging to offer that full reward because of sort of the co-location requirements we had. So if you're doing electrolysis and you're making hydrogen out of water using electricity and it's renewable electricity, the full reward is now available to you, even if the generation of the renewables are not on site, which was the holdup from the old text. Yes. Yeah, they would have to have the RECs and retire the RECs, basically, and not use them for RPS purposes or any other voluntary purposes. Yeah.
Sam, when you say renewables, are you focusing on any particular class of renewables, or is ARB
Mm-hmm.
LCFS
Sure.
agnostic about what counts as?
Yeah. let me talk about the limitations that we have in the current proposal, and I'm sure this may still shift as the board and others give us more direction. But currently we're saying the renewables need to be in the same balancing authority as the load, the EV load. So we're really talking about, most of the EV load we're talking about in California, so the California balancing authorities, and therefore the renewables are basically in-state renewables. We're saying that the balancing or the connection that needs to be drawn between these two things is not fully temporally coincident, but can be done over 2 quarters. And so there is, some matching that's going on, and it's not real time. But we are not saying explicitly that they have to be RPS eligible resources at this point in time, if that's, sort of the heart of your question. We're open to talking about large hydro and, other things that may not qualify for RPS, but I do think that's an area that I expect, there to be some debate about. The reason we do that is that in our carbon intensity scores we do already for the electricity sector, large hydro is counted, and so, that it's already sort of in the system. But I'd be open to hearing more from everybody about what folks think about that. Yeah. Any other questions? John?
So with the promotion of EVs, is ARB still considered as a fuel neutral reg?
Yeah, I mean, so what we think we're doing is leveling the playing field with this proposal between the way it's working for renewable natural gas and the way it could work for electricity. So renewable natural gas never had a co-location requirement, right? Like there are landfills very far away from California that are serving this program right now. And we're trying to eliminate the co-location requirement on renewable power because we don't view that as equitable, right?
I just wanted to go back to your comment about digesters being able to earn not only LCFS credits, but did you say cellulosic?
They do, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you ever think that RECs from out of state would be eligible for these programs?
So,
About leveling the playing field?
right. So we've said, I guess a full leveling of the playing field would be all RECs are eligible no matter where they're from, because that's basically for renewable natural gas right now, we constrain it to North America and the North American pipeline system. But we're not going that far in the proposal. In the text that's out there on the street, it says that the generation and the load needs to be in the same same balancing authority. So we're taking one incremental step away from co-location for EV load, and we're not going as far as to say they can be from wherever. Okay, thanks a lot.
Can everybody hear me on the mic? No, not really. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, let's see. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Cory-Ann Wind, and I am the program manager for the Oregon Clean Fuels Program. Thanks for having me today. This is my first time at this conference. Like you said, most of the folks that are here now are from the carbon market side of things, and fuels is a relatively new track. So I really appreciate the opportunity to present the Oregon side of this story. For those of you that don't know, the program for the Oregon Clean Fuels Program is very, very similar to the California LCFS. I would say probably 90%. The basic design of the program is identical to California. We work very closely with CARB to harmonize the policy so that all of the market participants can know the general rules of the game in our program as well as the California program. And in this way, we can also collaborate on a lot of things like carbon intensity scores and reporting systems and whatnot. So we don't have to recreate the wheel for the state of Oregon compared to the state of California. Our program actually has a different starting date from California. We have a 2015 baseline, and then 10% reductions between 2016 and 2025. Referring to the question that was asked before, For the state of Oregon, that 10% reduction is actually in statute. So if we do want to move beyond the 10% in the future, we'd have to go back to our legislature and ask for additional authority to go beyond 10%. But since we're only in the beginning stages of our program right now, we're focusing on implementation of the first 10 years of the program, and then we'll have future conversations about beyond that as we go along. So let's see. So like I said, the program began implementation in 2016. So we are currently in our 3rd year of implementation, which also means that we're coming up to our first kind of compliance obligation demonstration that we need to do. So in our program, the first 2 years of the program was actually combined into a single compliance period. So 2016 and 2017 reductions need to be reconciled by the time that the reports are submitted at the end of April for 2018. So, but what this is an indication of is of the quarterly reports that we've received from our regulated parties going back to Q1 of 2016. So there is more credits and deficits that are being generated in the program in the bars, and on our green line, it is the growing bank of credits. Just to give you an idea, the fuel consumption in the state of Oregon is about a 10th of what it is in California. So everything gets scaled down by an order of magnitude. But there's a steady increase in the amount of credits that are being generated. That's a good sign. What you don't see here is, well, I'll get to kind of in the future, in a couple of future slides, but what you don't see here is a lot of the credits from the residential EV charging, and I'll get to that. The fuels for the state of Oregon that are generating credits, you see a lot of from biodiesel and ethanol, and a little bit from other. We have had propane in our program from the beginning. Natural gas, renewable natural gas, propane, electricity. In the state of Oregon, we do have state-mandated blending requirements, so 10% ethanol and 5% biodiesel in all of the on-road fuels. So as opposed to California, where in their beginning they didn't have a lot of biodiesel in its baseline, we do. Mandated 5%. So you can see, the credit generation heavily being generated from those liquid biofuels that are mandated to be blending, and then slowly increasing on those other kinds of fuels. This kind of gives you an idea about the other alternative fuels that are participating in the program. I think what you'll see is that, I think as Sam pointed out earlier too, we do have a pretty limited demand for natural gas. There's not a lot of natural gas fleets in the state of Oregon, but the ones that are participating are transitioning more to the renewable natural gases than the fossil natural gases, so that's a good sign. And we also do have increase. We also have some LNG fleet that is on renewable LNG as well. And pretty just kind of steady propane consumption. The electricity line here represents the public charging side of EVs. So it's the companies that own the EV chargers for public charging, for fleets, workplaces, the non-residential applications. This is a graph of the clean fuels credit market. So like I said, still in the beginning part of our program, but we have been selling the Oregon clean fuels credits back till November of 2016. The bars are the total of credits being traded in the program now. And then the line on the top is what the average credit price is. I want to say the credit price in February, the $58.40 is the average credit price. So, and then that'll be interesting to kind of see for the March and April timeframe, since we are at that point where the regulated parties do have to comply with the standards for the first time. So for our program, we had a pretty major rulemaking that we did in the 2017 program. And I'm going to kind of, a lot of, like I said in the beginning, a lot of our program is based on the California model. And I think I'll kind of focus on some of the points that are like a little bit different in Oregon. One of the things that is the same is that in 2017, we did formally adopt a credit clearance market, similar to California. So it's a $200 cap for the 2018 period to be increased by CPI increases in future years. So that's in the program now. We did make some additional updates to the record-keeping requirements with respect to credit transactions. I think that's just kind of, it makes it more specific to the credit information as well as the fuel reporting information. And then we added in some market-based, requirements for market monitoring for the program. One of the things that is different in Oregon is we do have a series of safeguards that is mandated by our legislature. And in safeguards, what it is a balance between the availability of the kinds of clean fuels that we need to meet the standard and then the feasibility of the program to actually meet those requirements. So we do have two different kinds of deferral mechanisms. So first, an emergency fuel supply deferral. So these are, this is put in place to be able to address a short-term shortage in fuel supply. So, an example is, since we have so much fuel in Oregon that is imported from out of state, right? So if the rail lines, are impacted and we can't actually import these lower carbon fuels. Short term, less than a year kind of period, doesn't really affect the future standards going out into the future. So we can do some kind of deferrals in the standard to actually address a fuel supply, this kind of short-term shortage. We also have a forecasted fuel supply deferral. And so the way that this works is that, again, to kind of address the general feasibility of the program, every year, every fall, we are mandated to actually look at next year's standard. So we look at what the next year's standard is, forecast what the deficits generation is going to be from the gas and diesel consumption. We estimate what those deficits are, and we look to the availability of the clean fuels that are available to the state of Oregon. This is a physical type of fuel supply forecast. It's not a market-based one. So we're looking at just all of the fuels that can come to the state. And we basically do an analysis about whether there's enough credits to match the amount of deficits that are going to be required. And it's not like a red light, yellow light kind of thing. There's always a green light that we're going to assume that we're going to go to the next year. But if there is, the fuel supply forecast shows that there is a shortfall, then we can actually make some changes to that standard for the following year. And obviously, from the program standpoint, we don't want to making those constant adjustments to the standards. We do want to provide the strong signal that we want to move forward. But this is the kind of the safety step that we take to make sure that those next year standards are feasible. Some changes that we made to the electricity rules last year. So similar to what Sam has been talking about on the electricity sector, we do have a statewide CI for the Oregon electricity grid mix. We also have the option of individual utilities opting in for a utility-specific carbon intensity. This is based off of information that they already report to DEQ under our mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program. So it's pretty simple for us to go through the mechanics of just calculating what that is. We do require utilities on an annual basis to opt into this number. So a utility will be approved to use a statewide or an individual carbon intensity. And then that carbon intensity can be accessed by utilities when they do their residential EV calculations, as well as public chargers that are using the electricity in those utility service areas as well. We added in, we have a manufacturer charger, EV charger in Oregon that does have solar panels on it. And so again, to reward the renewable aspect of that electricity being used for that charger. Our current rules do require co-location of that renewable source. And as Sam said too, we'll be having discussions in the future about how to go to that next step to reward the renewable electricity. We did add in last year electricity credits that are available for transit in the state of Oregon. We do have electric light rail streetcars. We have aerial tram in the city of Portland that actually replaces a ton of diesel bus traffic in the city. And then the emergence of the electric buses in the state as well. And then for the utilities to actually generate the credits on the residential side of things, we did clarify those rules to really incent the utilities to participate. So in Oregon, a utility has to opt into the program. So by October 1st, they have to basically notify the agency that they want to opt in for the future credits. So last year, in October 2017, 14 utilities in all basically opted in to generate the credits for 2018. And when they opted in to generate the credits for 2018, we also retroactively generated the credits for 2016 and 2017. Like I alluded to in one of the first slides, those credits for those residential EVs were never generated. So that's the opportunity now to retroactively generate them and assign them to the utilities. So moving forward, those entities that are opted in will generate those credits. For the ones that are regulated by our PUC, there is a docket that is basically directs the IOUs to have plans to monetize those credits and to invest those credits. And so that process is going to be beginning for the largest two of the utilities in the state of Oregon, so that's Pacific Corp and Portland General Electric. And so we'll be seeing programs come out of the PUC in the summer. For the ones, we also have a large number, like 12 of the COUs that are doing these plans as well. And so they'll be going through their individual boards or municipalities to actually get approval for those plans. So that's a very exciting new step in the state of Oregon with the utility engagement. And then we have this last thing on the bottom. It's an aggregator, backstop aggregator. So for the utilities that have opted in, I mentioned that 14 opted in. They represent about 90% of the total number of residential EV credits in the state of Oregon. So there's the last 10% are stranded. And we didn't want them to go completely stranded. So what we've done is set up an entity called a backstop aggregator, where there's a nonprofit organization that is basically went through a public selection process, and then approved by our Environmental Quality Commission to actually take those stranded credits and then to monetize and invest that as well. So we just went through this process with our commission, and the Fourth Mobility Group is an organization in Oregon that does a lot of consumer education for electric vehicles. So they are the recommended entity to be the backstop aggregator. So we're in the process now of doing MOU language with them and to get those credits and to establish some annual work plans about how that money will be spent. And the last thing from the 2017 rulemaking is some transparency kinds of items. These are things that you see commonly out of the CARB program. So it's the monthly credit transaction reports. We've got the same reports online now, and the quarterly data summaries. And we also have an additional legislatively mandated values that we need to publish on an annual basis about the amount of greenhouse gases that are reduced by the program and what that average cost per gallon of diesel, gallon of gasoline, gallon of diesel, what that cost of compliance is on an annual basis. For 2018, we do have a new rulemaking that we've started. We've had one meeting so far, so we haven't really fleshed out a ton of ideas. But generally speaking, what we're looking at is what is incorporated in the CARB rulemaking this year. So third-party verification. Obviously, the biggest difference in Oregon trying to do a third-party verification versus California is we don't have a current cap-and-trade program. So, for the Clean Fuels program to stand up an entire verification program, that is something that we're trying to consider and how we can work that out. but similar requirements to look at the carbon intensities of the fuels that are coming into Oregon, as well as third-party verification of the reporting, of the quarterly reporting. We are looking to update GREET model, both on the OpG side, the crude source slate that comes to the state of Oregon, as well as updating to 3.0 of GREET. We are looking at additional credit generation sources, as Sam mentioned, alternative jet, and previous things that we've talked about in our committee before about forklifts and TRUs and truck stop electrification and those kinds of technologies. And then lastly, just to update the enforcement provisions, with all of the rulemaking that we did in 2017, we just wanted to make sure that the enforcement rules were consistent with what was adopted. I think that might be all. So the timeline for our rulemaking is, so we hope to have 3 more meetings, May, June, July, and then have a public comment period over the summer, late summer for us, August, September, October, and to go to our commission in November so that the rules would be effective for 2019. Okay, that's pretty much it. You have any questions about the Oregon program at all?
Just briefly, you mentioned the public charging stations. Are any of those owned by private entities, or are they owned by utilities, or how is this allowable?
Well, for the public charging stations, it's whoever owns the charger. So it could be public, like a lot of cities and counties actually own charging stations, but there's a lot of private companies that own them as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I have a question, and thank you, very good presentation. So on the alternative jet fuel, I represent the Airlines for America group that has been putting that proposal in. I was curious, we have submitted comments before. We understood there would be a comment process this summer, but you mentioned meetings happening sort of now or May, June, July. Do those allow public input, or are those internal preparation?
Those are all public meetings.
Okay.
And so you should get onto our email list for the rulemaking, and those are all public. We have them in Portland, but we always have call-in for that as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned you had a report on annual greenhouse gas reductions. So how did you look at the carbon intensity of the biofuels? Or what, because I think later on you said you were looking at verifying the carbon intensity of the fuels coming in. So what's that? So does that report come out, and how did you?
So for the total greenhouse gas reductions, we would look at the amount of credits that were generated in an annual period, because that's the credit is a ton of reduction.
With the renewable fuels coming in, are those have emissions associated with them?
So each of the fuels that come in already have individual carbon intensities for all of them coming in. So we know what it is now. I think what I'm talking about is in addition into the future about third-party verification for those values. So we already work with all the producers to establish what their carbon intensities are.
Oh, but they don't.
It's not third-party verified right now.
Well, they're reporting to you, but they are. So do they use some standard to calculate that?
So it's GREET. It's the GREET model.
Okay.
So it's the same model that California uses. So again, most of the fuels that we get also go to California. So if they have a carbon intensity with the state of California, we honor that. We do an adjustment for the travel distances, to Oregon versus California. We do have a handful of fuels that do come to Oregon that don't go to California. So in that instance, then DEQ, we do the carbon intensity verifications. But at this point, it's not third-party verified. So we have all the individual CIs right now.
So you've done some reviews on those? Did you find any errors, or?
Yeah, we go through the same process like CARB, right? So everybody has to submit the GREET model, the spreadsheet, 2 years worth of documentation to support the inputs into those models. So we go through all of that. Yep. Okay. Jordan. Right, so, gosh, my timing is a little off now, but we did go to our Environmental Commission, I want to say late March, where they did approve Fourth Mobility Group to be the backstop aggregator. And I think in this slide, I actually added another entity in there, so it said the Environmental Center. So the Environmental Center is an NGO that works out of the Bend, Oregon area. They do a lot of community work. And so in that Bend area, Fourth is going to be working with Environmental Center to actually implement any kind of targeted programs for consumer education and rebates or incentives in that area. But then Fourth will do the rest of the state. Okay.
Okay, great. Can you guys hear me okay? So I'm Peter Weisberg, Senior Portfolio Manager with the Climate Trust. And this is going to be much more narrowly focused on dairy digesters. And I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons to this crowd in particular. It's such a unique crowd to get to talk about this too, where a lot of the new carbon intensity for dairy digesters that is so extremely negative is based on methane reductions that have historically been credited through the livestock protocol in California. And so there's a very direct tie not only to the cap and trade market, but specifically to the offset market. And so I'm very interested in all the wonky details from the protocol and how that's converted into LCFS. That's not what I'm going to talk about here, but instead, some ideas around how to facilitate financing of these projects where, because the carbon intensity is so extremely negative, environmental credits end up being a huge portion of the revenue stream. And we've seen historically that lenders and investors heavily or completely discount long-term environmental credits because of primarily the regulatory risk associated with them. So a couple of different concepts that are being discussed right now for how you can overcome that and establish some credit enhancements to allow for early stage projects to get finances where I'm headed eventually. But just first, to put dairy digesters in the context of the rest of the LCFS. So this is California focused. In this, let's see if I have a pointer. Yeah, I do. So this darker line here, this is the now California proposed 2030 targets for carbon intensity standards every year. So if you're traditional gasoline, you're above that line. The difference between the two are the deficits that you generate, and you have to go out and buy a metric ton reduced from the intensity target for every metric ton that you're above the intensity target. And you can see here's where a traditional fossil CNG sits on that line, and then coming down in the carbon intensity, sugarcane ethanol. Starting to get into the negatives are food waste biogas. There was a very old pathway for dairy digestion that was at the 13 level, so somewhere around here. And that pathway didn't include the avoided methane emissions that are normally and have been credited under the offset protocol. But now the new pathways have come out that are including those methane emissions, and it sort of throws the whole graph out of whack, where now dairy renewable natural gas is extremely negative, negative 254 on the carbon intensity scale. And so as Sam had the numbers in terms of dollars per MMBTU, which I think is one good way of looking at it, but another that I think is meaningful perhaps to this crowd is comparing it to the offset value. And so just running some numbers there, this is a very similar, it's the same avoided methane emissions, but what are they worth in the offset market compared to what are they worth in the LCFS market? And so using a relatively conservative LCFS price, $90 per ton, that's current prices are in the 140, but as we saw in Sam's diagram, they've been up, they've been down, and for a long time there's been a lot of volatility, but I think 90 is a conservative look here. The LCFS credits are worth about $600 per cow if you make an assumption about how much energy each cow produces. Or for an 8,500 cow project, that's revenue of around $5 million a year. That's compared to the same project on the offset side, it's $54 per cow. And so even at somewhat conservative pricing for the LCFS market, it's 11 times more valuable as an LCFS credit than as an offset. And so the market has recognized this, and there's a lot of interest of taking dairy digester projects and getting fuel into the pipeline, because in order to generate an LCFS credit, it needs to be contracted to be used as transportation fuel in either California or now in Oregon. And so that's great. There's a lot of excitement. There's also a lot of barriers to taking this potential and turning it into financing for building actual projects. And so another way of looking at these projects is the percentage of revenue that's coming from environmental credits. And this is analysis from the Air Resource Board, where basically traditional financing for digesters is very flipped on its head, where offsets were something like 10 to 30% of the revenue of projects over their life on the offset side. Now with these very negative LCFS values and the cellulosic RIN credit, environmental credits are 90% plus of the revenue that can go into these projects. And so you can see here that the fuel sales are only 7 or 5% of projects. It's also electricity projects that can't make LCFS credits are accustomed to having, that are that 70% plus of revenue to digesters, are 20-year PPAs with creditworthy entities. So very financeable contracts to help build these projects. Fuel sales are often on a much shorter time frame. And so that, again, has thrown, okay, how do you finance these projects that have this extreme potential environmental credit value when the sort of traditional creditworthy components of the revenue are basically absent from these projects? And so I'm drawing a comparison here that I hope is meaningful to this audience. I feel like it's almost meaningful to no other audience than this, but how do the risks of financing in the offset market compare to the risks of financing in LCFS? And I think the real key here is that the cap and trade market has a price floor. You can't call it a price floor, but you can put it in quotes as a price floor, because the sort of fundamental driver of supply in the market are allowances that are auctioned by the Air Resource Board, and they've set a minimum price at which they will auction. Now it's a price floor in quotes because secondary market can and has traded below that floor, but as long as the system is healthy and robust, you would definitely expect prices for allowances to be at or above that floor, and offsets have historically traded at a 20 to 30% discount from that floor. And so in trying to get an investor to go through the brain damage of understanding these markets, having a floor like that is really, really important to be able to reference. And in the LCFS, the Air Resources Board isn't providing any instruments in the same way that they're providing allowances to the cap and trade system. And so because of that, because all the transactions are bilateral, there's no ability to set a floor there. They have set both Oregon and California have set the credit clearance market for a ceiling, but again, no floor to prices. And you've seen that show up in historical price data. So I stole Sam's slide from his PowerPoint here, where you see this big volatility in LCFS prices. Here's where lawsuit froze the carbon intensity targets, and the market was very uncertain around what was happening. And now these very high prices, again, in the 140 range here. And when you compare that to offsets, where there's sort of been this steady increase over time, well, that's really tied to this dashed bar as the floor. That's really tied to the slow and steady increase of the floor. And so, again, when talking to that investor and going through these potentials, this is a much more encouraging picture than this volatility as well. So I wanted to briefly talk about the work that we've done in our at the Climate Trust around offset financing, because I think it has an important lesson for LCFS as we look at financing LCFS projects, and as others do also, where on the offset side, we've been looking to provide upfront finance to digester projects in return for shared ownership of the offset credits. And as we were raising capital for that concept, again, the regulatory risk came up as a primary barrier to doing this. This was before the cap and trade system was extended. There was a lot of concern about post-2030. There were outstanding lawsuits about whether or not auctioning allowances was a tax, all of that uncertainty. And so what we did is we took our nonprofit that has a ongoing demand for offsets and provided a put option to this fund that said, no matter what happens, if the lawsuit goes through, if the market gets removed, all of those things, we'll step in, we'll buy at this minimum price. And it was by having that minimum price guarantee that the Packer Foundation provided a program-related investment to our project that we're then going out and lending to projects in return for shared ownership of the credit. So this was a way of saying, yes, you can paint a picture in these markets where everything goes to zero, and because of that, we're going to mitigate that regulatory risk by having this put option in place. And what that enabled us to then go on and do is provide upfront capital to dairy digester projects in return for their offsets. We know we'll have that minimum value over their life. We help them generate the credits and sell them onto the market. And then we anticipate we'll never need to use that put option because now the cap and trade system is extended through 2030, again with that floor with a lot of strong signals. And then that just turns these long-term revenues to the project that lenders and investors have been unwilling to value into an upfront source of capital that can be used to construct the projects. And so we're very interested in, okay, that was the story on the offset side. In some ways, there's more certainty long-term on California's offsets because of the extension and the price floor. So what's the equivalent that could be done in the LCFS to drive capital to these projects that have very large potential revenues from markets, but that face this risk that lenders and investors are concerned about? And SB 1383 that was passed in California requires 40% methane reductions by 2030 from dairies in the state. So huge reductions. It also comes up with a list of enabling criteria of how is the state going to do that so that dairies don't just leave the state, but instead are able to mitigate their emissions economically and maybe even see new opportunity in mitigating those emissions. And one of the most interesting criteria in that bill is the requirement to build, it's called a pilot financial mechanism that mitigates uncertainty for long-term value for LCFS credits in the market. And so I think these enhancements are really, really interesting, and I just wanted to take you through a couple of examples of what's being considered right now by the Air Resource Board, where they've been talking about the put option model, that same model that we used on the offset side, or this alternative, contracts for difference. So essentially, in the put option model, you would take a pool of public capital, and then you go out and you run a reverse auction that says how many people would want to buy a put option with a minimum price of $80. And you run that auction, and if the number of bidders is above that total pool, then you keep ramping down the strike price within that auction until you set the minimum price that enables you to get under that budget. And so there's a reverse auction to make project developers compete against each other in order to ensure that the most economic projects are the ones that are rewarded by this enhancement. This is modeled after a similar facility that's run by the World Bank called the Pilot Auction Facility that had $53 million of donations behind it to guarantee those puts, that was run to help facilitate methane and nitrous oxide projects internationally. And interestingly, that's not what I wanted. Interestingly, the U.S. State Department was a donor to this facility. And so part of our thinking has been, in this America First world, now is a great time to bring credit enhancements like this to projects in the United States that are facing similar problems. And so this is from the Air Resource Board of look at those two models at how a put option would work, where basically projects pay a premium up front in return for receiving the insurance. And that premium is really important to this model. It's a way that you make sure projects have skin in the game and they're not just taking free insurance, but instead that they really believe in their ability to produce these credits. Then you set a strike price. Here the example of the strike price is $80. And so if the price is below, then the administrator here who's running this facility makes up the difference. So you get that $80 strike price. And if the price is above, you purchase the insurance, you don't need to use it, no payments are made, but financing was facilitated knowing that that $80 is available. The one other, just really quickly on these details, the one other option being considered is contracts for difference, where you would bid in to set a fixed price the project doesn't pay anything up front for that, but instead knows that if the market is below that price, they'll be paid back up to that price. But then the cost to them is if the market is above that price, that difference gets paid back into the facility, and so they're giving up the upside. So just sort of a quick comparison of the two models. I think the key thing to keep in mind is how are you structuring a cost to project developers, where in one, they're paying an upfront premium, and in the others, they're giving upside to the market. And then just a quick, so we've been really excited about this model also, and we've been working with USDA about the potential to use credit enhancements like it to launch voluntary agricultural offset projects as well. And so we have received a USDA Conservation Innovation Grant to run similar to the World Bank's model, a similar auction for puts. It would start with voluntary offsets because that's the capital that we have to guarantee, but it could be applied to a lot of different environmental markets as a way of overcoming this sense that there's a lot of potential and a lot of potential value, but lenders and investors ultimately are thinking of the worst case scenario and therefore heavily or completely discounting the markets that we're working in. So that's my presentation. I think the key message for me is that I think there's a lot of potential for dairy digesters in this sector, but now is a time where some kind of enhancement is needed. We have in law 1383 of building the pilot financial mechanism. I think it's a really important time to get behind it, support it, to start building projects based on these markets. Thanks.
If there are no questions, I believe it is lunchtime, so maybe if anyone has any questions for Peter, perhaps you could ask him after.
Yep.
But yeah, thank you all so much for attending, and have a great rest of your conference then.